Rock and roll music has been controversial right from the start, and many of the artists and musicians are controversial as well. But something else that can really be controversial is the album artwork that went along with this great music. Hey there, I'm Richard Maddow. This is for people who love music. That's you. And today we're going to be talking about some of the most controversial album art. Now, when I was a kid, still living at home in my parents' house, I think I spent just about all my time laying on the floor of my bedroom with a record playing, with the album cover open on the floor. I'd be staring at the album cover, reading all the credits, of course, the musicians, engineers, producers, liner notes. But the album cover was always so striking, and I remember just staring at it. And the album covers were so important back then. Of course, they got less important in the cassette and then CD era when they were much smaller. And now in the streaming era, you just see a tiny little thumbnail of the album cover. But fortunately, for some people, vinyl's back and album art can still be really important. So let's talk about some of the most controversial album art of all time. Some of these were actually banned or replaced, and you'll find out why. Okay, let's start out with a band that was pretty much known as the first supergroup in rock music. That was Blind Faith, way back in 1969. A supergroup was a group comprised of musicians who were already famous from other groups. So Blind Faith, the first supergroup, we had Eric Clapton and Ginger Baker from Cream, the great band Cream, Steve Winwood from Traffic, and Rick Gretsch from Family. That was a supergroup if there ever was one, and one of the few supergroups that actually lived up to the hype, because their first and only album truly was fantastic. But it was the album art that generated a lot of controversy. The album art, as the album was released in England, showed an adolescent girl from the waist up, completely topless, holding this weird-looking airplane that some people interpreted as somewhat of a phallic symbol. Now, I'm not going to show you the whole album cover here. This is a kind of a censored version with the writing over it, but suffice it to say, the original album had no writing on the cover. You saw everything, for better or worse. And, of course, this offended us here in the U.S. So the U.S. album was issued with a pretty bland cover, completely different cover. Didn't matter too much. The music was fantastic. So really classic album and a classically known controversial album cover. Okay, let's go back a few years to 1966. The Mamas and the Papas, their incredible first album called If You Can Believe Your Ears and Eyes. This is still ranked as one of the best albums ever made. It's in many people's top 100, top 200, whatever. It contained the hits Monday, Monday and California Dreamin'. They were really a great group. So the album cover was the Mamas and the Papas, all four of them, two men and two women, all crammed inside a bathtub. And that album was controversial and was actually banned. Was it because there were two men and two women in a bathtub? No, it was because they showed a toilet on the album cover, and that was considered very vile back in 1966. So the album cover was changed. The toilet was I was going to say the toilet was clogged up. The toilet was blocked, so you couldn't see it. They listed some of the names of the songs over where that used to be. Wow, how controversial. Okay, now let's move to 1968. The Beatles are still together, but they're getting involved in their solo projects. John had met Yoko, and they recorded this really bizarre album called Two Virgins. Basically, they stayed up all night just recording weird sounds and instruments that made no sense, putting on reverbs and special effects. Honestly, the album was just horribly unlistenable. Fortunately, John redeemed himself in later years with classic albums like the Plastic Ono Band, Imagine, Walls and Bridges, Double Fantasy, all great albums for sure. This album was not good. And the thing people remember the most about the album was the cover, which was just a complete full frontal nude shot of John and Yoko. I'm not sure how many people actually wanted to see that, but nothing was held back on this cover. Their distributor, EMI Records, their record label in Europe, wouldn't even distribute the album. So they had to ask some of the more minor league record companies to distribute this album. And they did it in a brown paper bag with just little cutouts that showed John and Yoko's faces and the name of the album way down on the bottom. So wow, bad album, controversial cover. Okay, let's move on to a great album from one of the greatest bands of all time. This album, I don't know if I call it controversial, but very interesting in its own way, and I'll tell you why. That album is Sticky Fingers, the 1971 album by the Rolling Stones. Fantastic album, I think considered by just about everyone to be one of their best. It's got Brown Sugar, Wild Horses, Dead Flowers, Can't You Hear Me Knockin'. Every song on this album is great. Well, the album cover was also pretty spectacular. It was an Andy Warhol design cover, and it had an actual zipper. And if you could really, it was a metal zipper. You could unzip the zipper, and if you did underneath, you would see the man's drawers. You wouldn't see anything, too crazy. But it was an actual metal zipper, and the reason this was controversial was because a lot of record store owners complained that the metal would make impressions on other albums. They were smushed together too tightly. You get like little divots on the album sitting next to it. So I could always tell somebody had a good Rolling Stones collection if I pulled out their Exile on Main Street album, which was the album that followed Sticky Fingers. So if you kept your albums in chronological order, the Exile album would have a little indentation from the zipper, from the Sticky Fingers zipper. I know mine sure did. And probably due to expense and maybe that reason as well, this album cover was replaced with just a two-dimensional version of the same thing. It didn't have the real metal zipper. Great, great album. Let's continue with the Stones, another one of their great albums, Some Girls from 1978. They had what some people would describe as a little bit of a lukewarm streak in the mid-'70s, then really came back strong with Some Girls. It was the first album where, his name's escaping my mind, where Ron Wood was a full-fledged member of the band. You know this album. The title track, Some Girls, is great. It's got Shattered, Beast of Burden, Miss You, with that incredible rhythm section of Bill Wyman and Charlie Watts laying down that disco Stones. Wow. Great album. Super cool cover. The cover was actually die cut, little ovals, and then underneath, so the inner sleeve that held the record was actually thick cardboard as well, and it had pictures of some celebrities. Lucille Ball, Liza Minnelli were on there. You can see their faces kind of poking through those die cut ovals. Well, the Stones didn't bother to get permission, so Lucille Ball wound up suing, and they replaced that with just little things that said under construction, stuff like that. So they took the faces off. It's a really cool collector's item too, and a great, great Stones album. Okay, let's go back in time a little bit now. 1971, the third album by Alice Cooper, Love It to Death. Considered a classic metal album, one of the foundational albums of the heavy metal genre, has the great song, I'm 18 on it. Well, look on the cover. Alice Cooper, being his goofy self, does that old adolescent trick. He stuck his thumb through his pants zipper, through his fly, so at a quick glance, you would think it wasn't his thumb. You think maybe it was something else. Yeah, immature, right? We all used to do that. Anyway, that was recalled and airbrushed. I don't know if it was actually recalled, but later editions were airbrushed. They took out Alice's thumb coming through his fly, and they also removed his arm while they were at it. Why not just do a little amputation on the Love It to Death album? So great Alice Cooper album, really funny cover. Okay, a few years later, over in Europe, David Bowie releases his classic Diamond Dogs album, 1974. Rebels on that album, the great title cut, Diamond Dogs. Just a really good album all the way through. And you can see on the cover, there's kind of this weird hybrid of David Bowie and a dog, really creepy looking artwork. While in the original, very, very rare album, if you were to unfold that gatefold, let's just say it was very obvious that this was a male dog. So very few copies of that album made it to the public. They reissued it with a more generic dog version, so to speak. So Diamond Dogs by David Bowie. Great album, hilarious cover. Okay, this next one is controversial in a really strange way. On the 1977 album by Lynyrd Skynyrd called Street Survivor, it had What's Your Name on it. It had That Smell. Really great Lynyrd Skynyrd album. And as you can see on this cover, it's the members of the band and they're surrounded by flames. Well, that's pretty cool. But the crazy thing is, 3 days after the album came out, the band was involved in a horrible plane crash that killed 3 of its members. So the band itself kind of went down in flames. And here they were with this cover. It was just too much for people to take. It was replaced with a more generic picture of the band. It's Street Survivor by Lynyrd Skynyrd. Wow, crazy name, crazy cover. What a horrible series of weird coincidences surrounding that cover. Okay, let's get a little more modern now. Let's go to 1996. The great debut album by Matchbox 20, Yourself or Someone Like You, has a bunch of their great songs. 3 a.m. is probably my favorite song on that album, but you know this album. Well, it's got that goofy looking guy on the cover. Who the heck is that guy? No one seemed to know. 10 years later, he surfaced. His name was Frank Torres, and he sued Matchbox 20, claiming that they never got his permission to put his likeness on the album cover. He said that he was just walking down the street one day and some people came up to him and said, "Hey, can we take your picture?" And he said, "Sure," and boom, it winds up on the cover of this great album by Matchbox 20. He sued 10 years later, saying that the statute of limitations didn't matter because he had just found out about it 2 years prior, and it caused him all kinds of mental stress. Matchbox 20, controversial album cover. Okay. These weren't in any particular order, but I want to end with my personal favorite controversial album cover of all time. One of the most prized collectibles in the entire world of records. And many of you probably know I'm talking about Yesterday and Today, the 1966 US and Canadian release by the Beatles. Now, why do I say US released by the Beatles? Well, unbeknownst to most of us in the United States back then, we weren't getting the real Beatle albums. Capitol Records was taking tracks from some Beatle albums, kind of making their own like mishmash versions of Beatle albums. As a matter of fact, Yesterday and Today took songs off the Help album and the Rubber Soul album and a couple singles that the Beatles had released that weren't on any album. So you might think, well, how could they just take songs off Help and Rubber Soul? We already had these albums. They actually shortened those albums. So the European versions of Help and Rubber Soul had more songs than the American versions. Yes, we were getting badly ripped off here in the United States. Some people would even say they were butchering their albums. And here we are. We've got this Beatles album known as the Butcher cover. The Beatles dressed up in these grotesque smocks with baby dolls and raw slabs of meat, really sick looking. And some people theorized that that was the Beatles' response to having their albums butchered. Well, they never came out and officially said it. They said it was like op art, and Paul McCartney claimed it was kind of a protest against the Vietnam War. But for whatever reason, before this album even hit the shelves, the reaction from distributors was so strong that Capitol Records tried to recall 750,000 albums. I believe it was called Operation Retrieval. And before the album even hit the shelves, a few apparently got distributed to record stores and some lucky people bought them up. Most of them got sent back. Now, if you were a distributor or record store owner and you had these albums, wouldn't you have thought, hey, I'm going to stick a couple of these in my pocket? And this is a true collector's item. But strangely, just about all of them were sent back. And this very generic picture of the Beatles standing around a steamer trunk with Paul in the trunk, which some people think is a Paul's dead clue. We'll get to that on another video, got released as the official cover. So this is a very, very collectible album. Now, some people that have what's called the trunk cover will go to great lengths to remove the trunk cover to expose the Butcher cover. If you're going to do that, I would be very, very careful because most people that try it wind up with just a mess on their hands. There are professionals that do it, so Google around if you want to do it, find someone to do it. If you've got the trunk cover, how can you tell if you've got a Butcher cover underneath? Well, first of all, if it has the Gold Record Award on it, that's a much later pressing. There's no way in the world that could have a Butcher cover underneath. But hold it up to a bright light, look really closely, and look at the Butcher cover. You can see Ringo's black collar vest thing. Well, that shows through the paste-over trunk cover. So hold your trunk cover up to the light. If you see a little black triangle where Ringo's vest would be, where he'd be sitting on the Butcher cover, you've got yourself a collectible. My suggestion will be, if by some chance you do have one of these, don't attempt to peel it. Keep it as is because it's just as collectible, if not more, and it never gets ruined. Now, there are some out there called first state Butcher covers, which mean they were never, ever pasted over. Those are the ones that maybe some record store owners or distributors kind of stuck aside when they were supposed to return them. Those are the most collectible of all. I really, really doubt anybody watching this has one of those. If you do, good for you. And I love talking about the Butcher cover again. We'll probably do a whole video on that one of these days. But anyway, those are 10 of the most controversial and sometimes banned album covers in rock and roll. If you like what you're hearing, there's a lot more to come. Please push subscribe. get to be a subscriber to get to see these videos as soon as they come out. My name is Richard Matter. This is for people who love music, and I will see you at the show.